I am like super excited to give this because I've only given this talk two other times and it has turned out to be my favorite talk of all time. Even though I'm an engineer and I can talk about engineering, this is what I prefer to discuss. So today we're going to talk about building effective cross cultural teams. So, hi, I'm Emma. I am a software engineer. I currently work at LogMeIn in Germany, but I will be shortly joining Spotify this July and I'll be moving to Stockholm in Sweden. So, I'm very excited about that. I do some podcasting. I co host the Ladybug podcast. I'm also on JS Party. I have a few courses. I've worked with LinkedIn and front end masters. I do a lot of stuff. This talk's not about me. You can, find me on the internet if you would like to know more. But this talk is really half of a byproduct of my experience living and working abroad. So in February of 2018, I moved from Austin, Texas to Karlsruhe, Germany to begin a new life as a software engineer at LogMeIn. So I'd worked with people from other cultures before, but I was really unprepared to be thrust onto a team with so many different cultures. And I quickly realized that working with people from different cultures was kind of hindering my ability to collaborate effectively, but I was having a lot of trouble explaining why. Well, everything that we do, from the way that we write our emails to the way that we give negative feedback to our teammates and evaluate their performance, actually governs the performance of our teams. And understanding how culture impacts our efficacy as a team is really going to improve our day to day collaboration. So, today I'm going to share with you 5 key areas with which we can kind of decode how different cultures communicate and work to enhance our cross cultural collaboration. So this talk was inspired by two things. The first is a book that I will talk about any chance that I get, and it's called The Culture Map, and it's by Aaron Meyer. And this talks about how you can decode different cultures and work more efficiently together, how different cultures communicate, lead, experience time, and many other things. So we'll see some of the outcomes of Aaron's research in this talk today. But the second thing that I mentioned before that inspired this is just my personal experiences living and working abroad. Um, I've experienced many of these things that Aaron has written about, so I'll share a couple of my personal anecdotes with you today as well. So, first, we'll examine how different cultures communicate and how we can improve communication on a cross cultural team. Secondly, we'll take a look at how different cultures actually evaluate performance and give negative feedback. Third, we'll dive into the decision making process. So, how do different cultures actually make decisions? Fourth, we'll examine how different cultures build trust. And then we'll wrap things up by talking about how different cultures actually perceive time. And so you might argue that speaking about culture can cause us to stereotype individuals and place them within boxes as opposed to evaluating each person as an individual. And while it's really important to recognize everyone's individuality and not view every individual from the same culture as having the same characteristics, it would be pretty naive of us to actually disregard their culture altogether. Because when we don't consider someone's culture in the way that they communicate, we actually falsely view every interaction with them through our own cultural lens. The culture that we're raised in impacts the way that we collaborate and communicate. And understanding these differences is going to allow us to really enhance, again, the efficacy of our teams. So let's start talking about communication. So, as an American, when I think about what good communication means, I think about someone who's very explicit. They express their thoughts clearly and succinctly, and they really ensure that everyone's on the same page. And this is what we call low context communication. So, the messages are expressed very clearly and they're taken at face value. But what I consider good communication is not what other cultures necessarily view as good communication. So, in contrast, many Asian cultures, such as India, China, Japan, and Indonesia, for example, they value communication that is very implicit. So, this requires listeners to read between the lines, or what they call read the air. So, these high context communication cultures, the messages are implied, but they're not explicitly spoken. So this is a scale from the culture map, and it plots different cultures along this communication scale. So the left side are low context cultures. We can see the US is on the very far left. And on the right, we've got high context cultures, like we see Japan, Korea, and Indonesia. But the biggest takeaway from looking at all these charts that we'll see throughout this is it doesn't matter where a culture sits absolutely along this line. So it doesn't matter that the US is all the way on the left, and it doesn't matter that Russia is towards the right. What matters is its relative positioning to another culture. So someone from the UK would perceive someone from Germany to be lower context because Germany falls to the left of them. But me, is coming from the US, I'm all the way on the left. Germany falls to the right of me. So I actually perceive Germany to be higher contact. So it's all about relative positioning. In fact, the US is the lowest context culture in the world, and really all Anglo Saxon cultures fall to the left hand side of this scale. All countries speaking a Romance language, including many countries in Europe like Spain, Italy, and France, they kind of fall to like the middle right of the scale. And then many African and Asian countries fall to the right, with Japan being the highest context culture in the world. And again, it's really important to note that what you consider good communication is not necessarily what another culture considers good communication. So, someone from a low context culture values really explicit communication through verbal and written validation. They might perceive a colleague from a higher context culture as being a really bad communicator because your communication styles just don't, they juxtapose each other. They just don't get along. And this variation in communication style really traces back to the history of a culture. So, these higher context cultures like China and India typically have a long shared history. So, they're really focused on a relationship oriented society where traditions are passed on generationally. But in contrast, America, which is the lowest context culture in the world, is only a few hundred years old. And it has been impacted by a ton of immigration from all over the world. So, the US has a lot of shared history and different languages. So, to communicate effectively, Americans had to be explicit as possible. And the language of a culture often reflects its communication style. So, English is a low context communication culture. And we're talking about the United States. It's low context communication culture because we're very explicit. And there are over 500,000 words in the English language. But we take a look at a language like French, and France is a higher context communication culture. And they only have 135,000 words. So this would really illustrate that higher context cultures use the same words to convey different meanings. So we really have to read between the lines. Let's think about two people who've been together for over 50 years. They can probably communicate pretty seamlessly without many words. But two people who have just been together a year have to be a little bit more explicit in how they communicate to make sure that they're in alignment. So this kind of indicates how a history with a person can really impact the communication style. So, if you're from a low context culture and you've worked with someone from a high context culture, you probably perceive them as being a bad communicator, probably hiding behind these transparent messages. But if you're from a high context culture and you've worked with someone from a low context culture, you might perceive your teammates as degrading you by being overly explicit and redundant and stating the obvious. And while you might be considered a great communicator in your home culture, that doesn't necessarily translate onto a multicultural team. And all of these principles even translate to things like email etiquette. So when I was applying for my German visa, I sent an email to the German law firm informing them that like, hey, my flight to Germany is kind of coming up. It's like 3 weeks away. I still don't have my passport from the German consulate. And like 3 days went by, and then a week went by, and I'm sitting there and I was like, okay, maybe the building's on fire. Like maybe my email just got lost. Don't really know what's going on. But then finally, I received a response a few days later, just kind of saying everything's fine and I shouldn't worry. Well, if you've ever noticed in America, if you don't have an immediate answer, you still should send a follow up email. Say, hey, I don't know the status of your passport or your visa at the moment, but I will get back to you. But other cultures, like in Germany, if they don't have any updates, they simply won't communicate until they do. So this is very important because not all cultures are going to communicate the same way that we do. We have to stop making the assumptions that just because I would send an email saying I don't have any news, that doesn't mean other cultures will do the same. So, kind of given these different communication styles, like how can we really ensure that we are communicating effectively within our teams? So, when working with people from higher context cultures, it's really important to listen. Communication is not just about speaking, it's also about listening. So, listen to the meaning of what is being said and not just the words. And if you're managing a multicultural team with higher context team members, just be really mindful of the fact that people communicate in the ways that they're accustomed to. So instead of jumping to the conclusion that an employee is just a bad communicator, just try to recognize and empathize with the fact that they probably are just doing what they've been used to. And when working with people from lower context cultures, it's really important to be explicit in your methods of communication. So be clear, be redundant, be transparent. If you get off a meeting with someone from the US, for example, just send a follow up email or a Slack message, just kind of outlining or recalling all of the major takeaways from your meeting. This is going to ensure that everyone's on the same page. Okay, but what happens when you work on a multicultural team? How do you balance communication when you have people from different context cultures? Well, you might assume that the most miscommunications are actually happening between a person from a low context culture and a high context culture. That's actually false. Miscommunications happen most between two people from different high context communication cultures. So if I have someone from Spain and someone from France, they often will have miscommunications. And this is because high context communication works very, very well from the same culture. So if I have two people from Spain communicating, they'll communicate very well. If I have two people from France communicating, they'll do so very well. But if you put one person from each country together, it's going to be a little bit hard for them. And if we go back to this example of these two different couples, one who's been married for 50 years and one who has been together for a year, take one person from each pair and put them together. They can't communicate um, using these high context culture or communication. Um, like my point is they have to be explicit, right? They don't know each other. They don't have that shared history. So they need to be more explicit in their communication. So as a result, your multicultural teams really need to employ these low context communication processes to really ensure that all team members are in alignment. So be explicit, reinforce key takeaways, and your communication on your team will definitely positively improve. So another part of building high performing teams is understanding how to evaluate performance. How do we actually give constructive criticism? Well, while every culture believes in constructive criticism, it's very important to note that what I deem constructive might not be what my colleague from Germany deems as constructive. And so we very much so need to be on the same page as to what that means. So there are two types of ways to give feedback. The first is direct negative feedback. So in these direct to negative feedback cultures, your feedback's provided at face value. It can be kind of blunt and honest, and it kind of just speaks for itself. And when receiving feedback from someone who comes from a direct negative feedback culture, you'll see that they use a lot of upgrader words. And these are just words that kind of come before your negative feedback to make it feel more strong. These are words like absolutely, totally, and strongly. So you absolutely need to get this done by Friday, things like that. In contrast, we've got indirect negative feedback cultures. So in these cultures, feedback is provided more subtly, and the negative message is typically wrapped in a positive message to soften the blow. And this is what we would see in cultures like the United States that are lower context. And when receiving feedback from someone from the US, for example, you'll notice they use probably a lot of downgraders to precede this feedback to soften the blow. So, kind of, sort of, a little bit. Your presentation is kind of maybe a little bit too long, or yeah, your colors are maybe a little bit too subtle. You might need to make them sharper to be more accessible. So, these are the two different ways that you can give feedback. And we can actually, again, Oh, actually, before I get ahead of myself, there's a fun little translation guide called the Anglo-Dutch Translation Guide. And all of my notes are totally out of order, but we're going to go with it. So this translation guide is really funny. It's an example of how different cultures can perceive messages differently. And so it examined people from Britain and people from Dutch. Oh my gosh, what am I saying? Dutch people. So if the British person says, "Oh, this is very interesting," they might mean, "I don't really like it." But the Dutch might take that to mean, "Oh, she's impressed. She likes it." And if the British say, "Oh, this is an original point of view," they might mean, "Your idea is kind of stupid." But the Dutch might think, "Oh, she's impressed. Perfect." And so these are just a couple of examples of how we might make the assumption that we understand what our colleague is saying, but in reality, if they come from a higher context culture or they're giving indirect negative feedback, we might not pick up on that. So we can kind of map each culture again into, I'm totally ahead of myself. Okay, cool. No, it's fine. I'm good. That's why I keep looking down, by the way. I've got notes down here. So this is a chart from the culture map that really plots these cultures again along a feedback scale. So on the left, we have direct negative feedback cultures, and on the right, we have indirect negative feedback cultures. And me coming from the United States, I kind of fall in the middle, but you'll notice that Germany falls way to the left. And so when I first got to Germany, I didn't understand why everyone was so blunt, and I felt like everyone was out to attack me. And then slowly I realized, well, they're just used to giving feedback in a different way, and I'm not used to it. And once I understood that, it was able to kind of, I guess, level up my relationships with my coworkers and make things a lot clearer. And so since we've kind of talked about communication and evaluation, we can actually plot these into a 4-quadrant graph, and this is really, really neat. So if we take a look at the first quadrant here on the left, cultures that are low context and provide direct negative feedbacks, like Germany, Denmark, Australia, they may appear blunt, offensive, or even rude. So receiving messages or feedback from these cultures is quite straightforward because they really value honesty and transparency. But even though they value honesty and transparency, it's really important not to try to mirror the same behavior to someone from these cultures, because people in these cultures have communicated this way their entire lives. They understand the nuances of what's appropriate to say and what's not appropriate to say. And that's something that I, as someone from the United States, might not pick up on. And I can actually very easily offend someone from these cultures. So just because they provide, this direct negative feedback, does not necessarily mean that you should try to mimic that. So cultures that are low context and provide indirect negative feedback. Is that right? Low context, indirect negative feedback. That's totally not right. Here we go. High context, direct negative feedback. I'm gonna make sure I get my stuff right. So these are countries like France, Spain, Italy, Russia. They speak a little bit more of an ambiguous language. Again, we have to read between the lines, but they still provide direct negative feedback, which is really interesting because high context cultures are taught to read the air. They interpret the meaning behind what is meant behind what, instead of just taking what is said at face value. But when they give feedback, it's very straightforward and very direct. So it is a little bit of a juxtaposition. Cultures that are low context and provide indirect negative feedback, like the US, Canada, and the UK, are a little bit strange. And it often confuses a lot of European cultures, I've noticed, the way that we speak. So how often have you been given constructive criticism by an American colleague who started off with a few positive things about your presentation, for example, and then kind of sandwiched in a little bit of a negative comment? This is really confusing to people from other cultures. And also Americans as someone from the United States, I personally as well tend to over exaggerate every statement that I ever make. So I use a lot of excellence and amazings. And all of these words are absurdly confusing for people from other cultures who are really trying to determine what is actually excellent or what is actually amazing versus what's just good or nice. And how many times have you heard someone from, the United States start a meeting with "I'm thrilled to be here with you today"? It's like only an American would begin a meeting saying, "Oh, I'm thrilled to be here." It's like, are you really thrilled to be here? You'd be thrilled if you won the lottery. Are you really thrilled to be here talking about our return on investment this quarter? I don't think so. So if you want to work more effectively with someone from a low context, indirect negative feedback culture, just Be explicit with your feedback, but like be careful about your delivery. Kind of make sure to throw some positive reinforcement in there as well. And then lastly, when dealing with high context, indirect negative feedback cultures such as Brazil, China, and Japan, be sure to provide negative feedback in private. This should never be done in a public group or in a public setting. And there are a few ways to provide negative feedback to people from these cultures. The first is to give feedback slowly and over a period of time. So it's really customary to make gradual references to things that are going to be changing rather than just like being super direct about it. Secondly, you should say the good and omit the bad, which sounds really interesting. And this fascinated me when I heard about this. So let's actually take a little example. Suppose your Japanese colleague sends you a 20-page presentation to review, and most of the slides look super wonderful, but the last 5 slides look a little sloppy. You can tell him simply the first 15 slides of your presentation look great. That's it. There's no need to say, oh, the last 5 slides are not looking so good. If you simply just say the first 15 slides look wonderful, he's going to read the air. He's going to understand he needs to work on the last 5 slides, and you don't actually need to say anything direct about it. So, understanding how these different cultures evaluate performance and give negative feedback can really positively impact your efficacy as a team. So, something I've come to notice during 2 years living and working abroad in Germany is that Germans and Americans make decisions in very different ways. Ironically, both cultures perceive the other to be really hierarchical in nature, so following really strict protocols and procedures. But these misconceptions are kind of fostered from a lack of cultural decision making and misunderstanding about that. So, as Americans, we're really rooted in these egalitarian principles. So, we advocate equality for all people. But while we inherently believe this is a core value, when we view our decision making process through a Germanic lens, we start to see discrepancies. So in America, we have these very hierarchical business structures, this formality between the boss and their subordinate, and these formal business titles that are used. Germans perceive Americans to be really hierarchical in their decision making process. And this is because German culture places way more emphasis on group consensus than the American culture, where decisions are made primarily by individuals. So in America, it's really not uncommon for a boss to step in and say, hey, this is the decision that we're going to make. And all the team members kind of fall in line and agree with that because we view quick alignment behind a decision to be extremely efficient. But what's ironic is the fact that the majority of egalitarian cultures who believe in the equality of all people practice consensual decision making. So normally they would make it as a group. But for some reason, America is an outlier, and this is very confusing. Swedish and Dutch cultures, for example, are both egalitarian and they practice consensual decision making processes. But countries like Morocco and Korea are more hierarchical in regards to leadership style, and they make decisions from a top down perspective. So when we have two cultures like America and Germany whose decision making processes clash, it can cause real issues within your team. So when someone says, we have made a decision, we will do this, a German person will interpret that as it's a commitment. They expect you to stick with that decision and not change it. So it can be really frustrating to your German colleagues when, as an American, you come back in a few days later and you change your mind and say, actually, you know what, we're going to change it up. We're going in this direction instead. And if you have two American people working on a project and you switch, you make a decision quickly, you get on board, and 2 days later have to change course, it's fine. You like typically that's normal workflow. But for your German coworker, this can be really, really difficult to deal with. And when we look at the history of two cultures, this juxtaposition of decision making style falls into place. Pioneers who kind of fled Europe and began a new life in America placed a lot of value on speed and individualism. So it was really all about working hard, even if you make mistakes. So as a result, American culture began to develop a disdain for too much discussion because they felt it would just like slow down their entire process. So instead, they decided to fail early and fail often, and that's a phrase that we say all the time. But this decision making process can actually severely impact the timeline of a project. Actually, I'm going to go back for a second. So in consensual decision-making cultures, it takes longer to make a decision because everyone is consulted. So if everyone's consulted, naturally it's going to take a lot longer. But once you actually settle on a decision, it's not going to change and you can go full steam ahead at that point. So this kind of illustrates that. So in a consensual culture, you're going to spend a lot more time discussing, but once you actually make the decision, you're never going to discuss it again. But in a culture that's top down, you have little discussion, you make a decision, and more time for implementation. So in hierarchical cultures, decisions are made early, they're made quicker, but they're more flexible. So as new information comes to the table, decisions or discussions are had, and the decision may be revoked or may be changed. And both of these systems totally works fine, so long as everyone uses the same system and is on the same page. But this is often a downfall, and I noticed this definitely in my personal experience, where I work in an American company in Germany, so it can be really confusing. Why are we changing direction all the time, and why is leadership giving us the decision? Why aren't we discussing this? So it's really important to kind of call out these discrepancies and try to come to an agreement on how you want to operate. So if you're working with a team that has more consensual decision-making processes, expect the decision-making process to take a lot longer and involve a lot of meetings and a lot of communication. Be patient and kind of check in with the team regularly to stay involved, but also resist the urge to push for a quick decision. If you are working with a team that has a more top-down decision-making approach, expect the decisions to be made by the boss and just be prepared to kind of support and follow that decision, even if you don't agree with it. So if you're in charge, you should be making decisions quickly. And if there's no leader present, kind of maybe suggest the team to take a vote for the best option. But also, really just make sure that you maintain flexibility throughout this entire process. Decisions in these cultures are not set in stone and they can be revisited when new information arises. And if you're working with a global team that has members from all different cultures, you have to really agree again on a method that works best for you. So clarify whether you want to make decisions as a group or if you want to use the top-down approach. Clarify whether you need 100% group agreement with a decision before moving forward, but also clarify whether or not your decisions are set in stone or if they can be revisited later on. Let's move into trusting. So, trust is really a foundational element of any relationship. But how different cultures trust and how that impacts your professional relationships is going to drastically differ from culture to culture. So, there are two types of trust: there is cognitive trust and affective trust. So, cognitive trust is really rooted in the confidence that you have in a person's ability to complete their job. This comes from the logical side of your brain, is really built through interactions in the office. Effective trust, in contrast, is really rooted in the emotional closeness that you kind of obtain from having a personal friendship or a relationship with another person. And this comes from the emotional side of your brain, and it's really built through the sharing of personal information with someone else. So, in a professional setting, Americans really draw the line between cognitive and affective trust because there's a long history of separating the practical and emotional sides of your relationships. And mixing the two is generally perceived as unprofessional. Chinese managers, on the other hand, actually intertwine these types of trust. And so they're likely to develop a personal relationship with someone when there's also a business relationship. So we've got task based trust that's really built through professional activities and working relationships. Um, but relationships are built and easily forgotten. If someone does really good and reliable work, trust is built. In contrast, relationship-based trust is really built through sharing meals and evening drinks. So if you've ever gone out to another country on a business trip and you notice, oh, let's go out as a team, let's go out to dinner. These are very important to these cultures, and you should absolutely be going to them. If you've shared personal time and stories with someone, generally trust is built in these types of cultures. So the further a culture falls towards the left side of the scale here, we can see again the US is all the way on the left. The more they like to separate affective and cognitive trust. So they separate their analytical and their emotional trust. And the further a culture falls on the right side, the more relationship based that they are. So more often these types of trust are intertwined. But just because a culture is friendly does not mean that they're relationship based. Americans are more likely than other cultures to smile at strangers and engage in personal discussions with people that they've just met. So, this can really be confusing for other cultures if you've ever sat next to an American person on a plane and you've had a discussion about your personal life. A lot of cultures don't do this. It takes them a long time to open up, and it can be very strange for them when they get off this plane and the person just says, "Okay, I'll see you later." To them, they've made a friend, they've made a lasting friendship. But to the American person, that isn't necessarily so. And this is a little frustrating. There's even a Russian saying that says, if we pass a stranger on the street who is smiling, we know with certainty that that person is crazy or else American. So these types of cultures are kind of referred to as peach cultures. So people tend to be really friendly and soft on the outside with people they've just met. They smile at strangers. They openly share information about themselves. They ask really deeply personal questions. But after a bit of friendly interaction with people from these cultures, you probably hit the hard pit in the center where the fruit protects itself. So friendliness does not equal friendship. And then in contrast, we have coconut cultures where people are more closed with others that they don't know, like the shell of a coconut. They don't smile at strangers. They don't ask a lot of personal questions of acquaintances. It really takes a while to kind of break through this shell. But once you do break through the shell, these coconut cultures become friendlier, and relationships, while it takes a little while to cultivate them, they tend to last a lot longer. And once we have a relationship that's established with these cultures and these effective trust cultures, it's a lot easier to obtain forgiveness after a cultural misstep. So, when working with international team members, it's super important to invest more time in building effective trust with them. And you can just do this by like cultivating common interests. It's also really important to be your authentic self. So, these relationship based cultures, they really value authenticity. And you can build up these types of relationships by just kind of like joining in with the crowd and going out to dinner with them and things like that. So, if you're going to work in a relationship based culture, such as Brazil, the moment you leave the professional office setting and head to a restaurant or to a bar, you should really begin to act as if you're hanging out with a group of close friends. So don't worry so much about saying or doing all of the right things. Be your authentic self. It shows that you have nothing to hide with them, and the trust is going to follow. Um, but you may be kind of wondering, like, why do some cultures place such a big emphasis on building personal relationships? And the answer might surprise you. Suppose that you're a Danish owner of a business that designs women's purses. So you sell 200 purses wholesale to a shop that has just opened on the other side of Copenhagen. So you give the retailer the purses and she promises to pay you the next week. Well, how do you know she's actually going to pay you? How do you know that you're going to get your money? Well, the shop owner signed a contract promising to pay you. So if she doesn't pay you, you can take her to court because you have a signed agreement in this culture, which has a consistently reliable legal system. And this makes it really easy to do business with people that you don't know or trust. Now imagine the same situation, but this time you are Nigerian and you're designing women's purses in Lagos. Well, the legal system in Nigeria is not the same as it is in Denmark. So you can sign a contract, but it's not going to be the same process of enforcing it if the payment doesn't come through. So in these types of cultures, like the only way you really feel assured that you'll be paid is just the trust that you have in another person. And so that's why in these types of cultures, cultivating these personal relationships with someone from Brazil, for example, like these are very important to them. So again, yeah, in many cultures, the personal relationship you have with another person is your contract. Lastly, we're going to just talk about scheduling. So I had no idea that different cultures perceive time differently. This totally blew my mind. So I'm hoping that this is a surprise to some of you as well. So how a culture perceives time governs everything from how they organize their day to how they run meetings. But not all cultures perceive time in the same way. There are two types of cultures as they relate to time. So we've got monochromatic time or M time and polychronic time or P time. So M time cultures view time as tangible and concrete. So if you say you're going to start at 4 p.m., it starts right at 4 p.m. But in contrast, P time cultures are more flexible in their approach to time. So someone who lives in P time will suggest a general time to meet, without nailing down the exact time. So it's more flexible. So living in Germany, I found that appointments and meetings happen generally according to plan. So the trains are very reliable. The government rules are very clear and highly enforced. There's a clear link between this cultural time and Germany's history. Well, Germany was one of the first um, countries to become heavily industrialized. So if you were a factory worker in the German automotive industry and you arrived to work even 4 minutes late, this had severe financial implications for the factory. And so, really, this M time culture arose out of this need to kind of maximize the returns. But in contrast, if you're a farmer on the Nigerian countryside, it doesn't really matter if you start work at 7 a.m. or 7:50. What matters is that your work structure is flexible enough to kind of account for and adapt to changes in the natural environment. So on the left side of this chart, we see linear time cultures like Germany and Switzerland. So these cultures, projects are really approached in a linear sequence. You have to complete one task before moving on to another task. You focus at one thing on at a time, and there should be no interruptions because your main priority is your deadline. On the right side, we see flexible time cultures. So this would be like Saudi Arabia and Kenya. And in these cultures, projects are approached in a more fluid manner. So you should kind of change priorities as new opportunities arise. And in these cultures, many different things can be handled at one time, and interruptions are totally normal. There's more of an emphasis on adaptability and flexibility. And how different cultures perceive time spills into meetings. So in the US or Germany, all meeting participants really understand that a meeting should be linear. There should be an agenda. It should be circulated ahead of time in the form of a list, and the meeting starts on time. And if you're talking to your neighbor during this meeting, is generally considered kind of rude. Any behavior that distracts from your main task is considered rude. But a meeting in a flexible time culture is kind of more like an evergreen tree. So it has an agenda with a meeting start time, and the topic will probably be circulated before the meeting starts. But this is going to serve as the trunk of the tree. There's no expectation that like the meeting is going to progress linearly. We might have different branches that sprout out over time. People may get up to take phone calls, or subgroups may form during this meeting within the room to discuss things that are kind of related. So, to deal with different scheduling scales, it's really important to be flexible in your work style and have a discussion up front about the frustrations that may arise. So, someone from a P time culture that's very fluid might get frustrated that their German coworker, for example, has to start on time and there's no ability to kind of branch off and explore new opportunities. So, just make sure you discuss this ahead of time. So today we've kind of taken a look at 5 out of the 8 of the different aspects of the culture map. The last 3 are persuading, leading, and disagreeing. And once we kind of understand the remaining 3 aspects, we can begin to plot different cultures along their map to indicate where your potential culture or where your potential conflicts might arise. So we can plot each culture along these 8 scales and draw a connecting line representing the culture's overall pattern. And where 2 cultures fall really closely together, it means they coincide with whatever that metric is. So we can see here on persuading, the third one down, they're quite close. So they shouldn't have too many conflicts when it comes to persuasion. But if we take something like, I don't know, if we look at communication, for example, between Germany and Japan, they're on complete opposite ends of the spectrum. And so you can see with this huge difference, you can visually tell here where conflicts are potentially going to arise within your team. As humans, we're all really motivated by the same fundamental needs, but every single person is different. Every individual is different. So you should always begin a new business relationship with someone from a different culture as a chance to really understand their unique aspects. But the culture that we're raised in does have implications on how we view the world, and people develop biases about what is considered good communication or which arguments are stronger than others. And when we work on a multicultural team, it's just really important to be conscientious of the fact that not every culture experiences life in the same way that we do. And learning about these different cultures is going to help us build an effective multicultural team. And again, the book is called The Culture Map. It's by Erin Meyer. I highly recommend reading it, even if you don't work with a ton of people from different cultures. It's such a fascinating read. So, with that, yeah, thank you. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to discuss this.